So today we're headed out into the woods to talk about aperture and how it affects your exposure and depth of field for landscape photography. So in a previous video, we talked about the histogram and how it reflected the tonal values that your camera was seeing and how it could be used as the foundation to getting a good exposure in landscape photography. With that in mind as the foundation, now we're going to start taking a look at the 3 things that you can change on your camera to influence that histogram and where it is, so you can help get it to where you want it to be. Those 3 things are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Today we're going to talk about aperture and how it affects the exposure, as well as another element to aperture, which is depth of field, which is something very important for landscape photographers to keep in mind when you're taking your photos. So let's dive into that. So aperture can change the little diaphragm in the lens as to how much light is getting into the camera and reaching your sensor. In order to change that, there's the aperture value, and you see them referenced like f2.8, f8, or f11, or f16, and things like that. So the way those work is the smaller the number, so something like f2.8, the larger that opening is, which lets more light into the camera. So if you're in a really low light situation, f2.8 can let more light into the camera. As you start to move up into f8, f11, that opening gets a little smaller and lets a little less light into the camera. And it continues to work its way up to where you get up into f16, f22, things like that, where that's a larger number. The opening in the lens is smaller and that lets in less light. So that's sort of how aperture works as far as influencing the amount of light getting into the camera. The smaller the aperture number, f2.8, the larger the opening and more light gets in through the lens to reach your sensor. Something like f16, smaller opening in the lens of the camera and the lens, and less light gets to the sensor. So that's sort of your aperture as to how it can influence things. If you want to move your histogram to the right, and if you want to handle that through aperture, you can change your aperture, make it a little smaller. If you're at f16, go to f8, that'll bump your histogram over to the right a little more. Likewise, if you are blowing your highlights out and you're at f2.8 and you want to let less light in so you can bring that histogram back over, you can start bumping your aperture up to something like f8, f11. It's going to make that opening in the lens smaller and that'll let less light in the camera, and it'll start to bring that histogram back in to the left, away from having those highlights blown, which we talked about in the histogram video is not a good thing. So aperture, in addition to allowing more or less light into the camera, also impacts the depth of field. And for landscape photographers, that's an important element, because depth of field is what's in focus from the near point to the far point. And in some cases you have a very shallow depth of field, in which case only a little sliver of things are in focus. And in other cases you have a much wider, deeper depth of field, in which case more things are in focus. As landscape photographers, we tend to be photographing things with a fair amount of depth in them, with elements in the foreground and distance. So knowing how that depth of field and what apertures to choose to get a deep depth of field is important. So something like an f2.8 aperture, which is letting more light into the camera, actually has a narrower depth of field. So if you're trying to keep a deep subject in focus, 2.8 is going to blur some of that in the closer to you and further from you, which might not be what you want. If you bump up into an f8, f11, you start to get a deeper depth of field, so more things are in focus from near to far. And that continues on up to like f16, f22, where you've got an even larger depth of field, so things from near to far in focus. So that's a really important element to landscape photographers. So yes, we can let more light into the camera with something like an f2.8 aperture that might hurt our depth of field, which is going to hurt the sharpness of our photos. So a lot of times landscape photographers are going to want to be more up into the f8, f11, sometimes even up to f16 and f22 to make sure they have the depth of field that keeps their pictures nice and sharp. So of course, if you need to keep up into the f8, f11 range, that's going to impact how much light gets in your camera, meaning we're going to settle in on an aperture, which means we're going to be left with only having shutter speed to change, and often to get more light in the camera, we'll have to lower the shutter speed, which is why us landscape photographers tend to use tripods a lot, is because we're trying to keep those aperture values up, sharp value, a deep depth of field, which means we have to run slower shutter speeds in order to get the light into the camera to get the image that we want. So those are things to keep in mind. And another thing to know about your lens is a lot of times those apertures more in the middle are actually the sharpest of the lens because of how lenses are constructed. Apertures at f2.8, they can get a little blurry, a little soft on the edges and things. So a lot of times your sweet spot is going to be, especially on like a full frame camera, you're going to be in like the f8, f11 is the sweet spot of your lens. So trying to keep your apertures in there will also help contribute you to getting a nice, sharp, crisp photo, just because the physics of the lens make it so that those apertures are letting the light come through some of the most precision part of the lens to get that light through to the sensor. So that's another thing to keep in mind, and that's why you'll see a lot of landscape photographers in that f8, f11, f16 range. Now with that said, there's times you're going to want to shoot f2.8. Maybe you do want to blur out a little bit of the background because you've got a very interesting subject in the foreground and you want that background to get blurred a little bit. That's a good case. Astrophotography, where the stars are so far away, you can get by with that shallow depth of field, and you want to have that light come into the camera, so you're going to look for that lens that can do like an f2.8 and f1.8 or something like that to help get that light in, because there the depth of field, you're shooting off almost into infinity, and the plane the star's on, as far as how the camera sees it, is sort of one plane, so that depth of field is not as important. And one other thing that really make this impact big, and why sometimes landscape photographers get into focus stacking, which we'll talk about in another future video. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just now, but if you have something in the foreground that's super close and then you have something far in the background, an example I'll do of this is sometimes, especially when I'm in the Southwest, is I'll have a cactus like up front in my foreground, nice and close to the lens, but then I've got these mountains way off in the distance. That's really exaggerating my depth of field, because I've got a foreground element super close, mountains far off in the background, and I'm really pushing my limits. And that's a case where sometimes you'll do one image of the foreground in focus, one image of the background in focus, and then blend them in Photoshop. Because it's when you do that foreground element versus the background element's really making that depth of field a very noticeable issue. A lot of times, if your foreground is further out, say like 15, 20 feet, then you get up and then your background's further from there. Once you get into the f16, f22 range, you're probably gonna be able to pull that off in one shot in a lot of cases. So, but that is one thing to keep in mind. If you're trying to pull off a foreground element really close to the lens and in a background off in the distance, that can be a difficult thing to do with even up to f16, f22. So just something to be aware of on that element. And finally, one other little caveat to aperture and how that can work is you start to bump up into higher f-stops like f22. You can have a thing called diffraction start to come in, which can actually introduce a little bit of softness to your images. Frankly, I think if you need f22, you need f22, and that trumps the diffraction element. But what happens is when that opening in the camera gets so small, like at an f22, when the light waves come in, it sort of distorts them as it comes through that tiny opening. And that distortion introduces a little bit of softness into your image. If you need that large depth of field, f22 is a fine aperture to shoot at, but you do want to be aware of that as you start to bump up. You might not want to run around shooting at f22 all the time. One, you're starting to get out of that sweet spot of your lens. Two, you might be starting to introduce some diffraction elements into your images. So keeping down, or f11, f8, f16 in there, depending on your lens, those are probably the sweet spots you want to be at, unless you specifically know you need that very deep depth of field, in which case f22 is fine. Just be aware some diffraction might step in and just soften the image just a little bit. So be aware of that. So just remember some of the things to keep in mind when you're choosing your aperture. It can influence how much light is getting into the camera. Something like an f2.8 is going to let more light into the camera. Something like an f11, f16 is going to let less light into the camera. So because of that, you can influence that histogram that we talked about as a foundation to getting a good exposure through your aperture. Now, Aperture also has things like depth of field to consider. And so landscape photographers, we tend to need those deep depths of field, which means you're going to want those higher f-stops, something like an f11, f16, things like that, to get the depth of field so that your whole image can be in focus and nice and sharp. So there's times where, although you want some light in the camera, in order to get the sharp image, you're still going to end up in those f11, f8 ranges for an aperture, which of course, histogram-wise, is going to cause less light to get in, which means you're going to have to accommodate that through either shutter speed or ISO, which we'll get to in another video. The other element to consider with your aperture is that lenses tend to have their sweet spot there sort of towards in the middle. So they tend to be a little sharper. When the light passes through, it passes through the most precise part of the lens. So your f8s, f11s tend to be the the sharp parts of your lens. So if you know you're really going for that sharpness, not only do you get the depth of field you want, you're also starting to come into that sweet spot of the lens. So that's something else to keep in mind with your aperture choice. And then finally, why we're not running around all the time with f/22s and things like that for every single photo, is the element of diffraction, which is as the light passes through a really small opening, which is like an f/22, you're really stopping down, and what happens is light waves come in and they sort of bend and bounce through that small opening, which can lead to a little bit of softness in the image. It's just a trade-off. Sometimes the f/22 is the depth of field you need, and so use it. Don't let it scare you off. It's just more of a, that's why we don't shoot at f/22 all the time, is because those sweeter spots are more down in those f/11s, f/16s, and things like that. So those are some of the things to consider when you're choosing your aperture out in the field. So we're going to take a little bit of time here. We're going to demonstrate a little bit of this aperture. We're out here in the middle of this woodlands. It's called the tall pines area of this particular park. Pretty frigid out today, but we're just going to take a peek. We're going to try to do some little bit of woodlands photography. I'll show you a little bit of the back of the camera, and we'll sort of show you what I'm looking at. We'll see if we can walk away with a few decent shots today. Okay, so what we've got out here is I've got these pine trees, lots of tall pines. Most of the greenery is up towards the top. And what I find interesting here is just the trunks all sort of scattered out. Relatively smooth woodland floor here, which is because of all the pines, keep a lot of the weeds and things like that going. So we're gonna try to get just something interesting here, and then we'll see how that turns out. Now for my aperture here, what we're looking at is I'm trying to shoot right between, I've got a tree right over here and one over here. I'm trying to shoot between them, but this one's gonna be in my frame a bit. So I'm gonna kick this up to about f/11 because it's gonna be in my frame just enough in the foreground that I'm gonna need that depth of field. It's probably about 20, 25 feet off. So we're gonna do that. I'm letting less light into the camera right now, so I'm gonna need to make an adjustment. I'm gonna adjust my shutter speed down, which is why we shoot on a tripod. I'm gonna watch my histogram because I do have a little bit of sky. My focus point is about 1/3 of the way into the image. I'm on self-timer. I am not on self-timer. Get it on self-timer. So shooting in portrait mode on this, nice and tall. These are nice tall pines, and so I'm shooting in portrait mode. We'll do some, I got a little spot over here. I sure want to do a wide look through, so the light's coming through decent. Again, lots of cool trunks and things like that. Just take a peek at what I got. So what I do want to do is I'm going to check my depth of field, make sure I'm good. So I'm going to zoom in on the image, and I'm first zooming in on this tree that I have over here, which is towards my foreground. It looks like it's nice and in focus. So then I'm going to peek out there to back, and the bark is pretty much in focus on that as well. So like I said, the elements I considered there was I had a little bit of this tree over here that is getting in my frame, which it's my closest object in the foreground. I have tree trunks off in the distance, and I felt like this was just far enough off that I could pull off an f/11. I didn't need to bump all the way up to an f/22 or anything like that. Just went with an f/11, took my shot. And then I do check the background, especially if you traveled far away. You know, you want to check that focus afterwards because you can always make an adjustment. Maybe I did need to go up higher. Maybe I should bump up to f/16. If I'd traveled a long way, I would definitely want to make sure I captured that. So, you know, it's okay to check that back of the camera to make sure you got that focus. So we're just going to shoot a composition off that direction. I got these sort of two trunks right there, a little bit of a line of the pines. That way, we're just gonna see what I can make happen there. Okay, so this will still require pretty deep depth of field here. I am shooting on my 24 to 200. I'm about a 50 millimeter range right now. Zoom in just a little. A lot of it, the trunks here, is like I said, they're all sort of lined. These tall pines, I'm pretty certain were planted like as part of our nursery, and so it was like non-natural growth planting, which is why everything's so much in a line out here, which makes it interesting. I've got sort of tree almost my foreground right here. I'm going to stick with the f/11. It is probably more like 40 feet away, so I should be able to pull this off pretty easy. Make sure my self-timer is on. Check my histogram. I don't have as much sky in this particular direction, so I am going to slow my shutter speed down just a little bit. I'm at 1/3 of a second, f/11, ISO 200. Boom, I like that. It's good. So now I'm just gonna look around, see if I can find Any other interesting compositions? Got the clouds building. We're actually expecting a fair amount of snowfall today. If we're lucky, we'll get a video on snow here in the next couple days. Okay, I've wandered around a little bit trying to look at compositions and see what I can get. And I think what something I want to try is there's some sun in the green in the trees. So I'm going to try to do a shoot up into the treetops just to see how that turns out. We'll see. The light's sort of cool. Just trying to find an interesting spot where that'll work, but let's give that a whirl. So it's like 25 degrees out here. Fingers are going a little numb on this, making all the dials a little harder to turn. So what I'm trying to do here is tall pines. That's the area I'm in, tall pines. So we flipped over to portrait mode because to accentuate that, I wanted more depth to show the tallness of it. Landscape wasn't doing that. It was just sort of ugh. So we got the tallness of it. Of course, now when you shoot this way, a lot of times in woodlands photography, you almost try to want to avoid the sky because it just makes trying to get the darkness of the trees, brightness of the sky is pretty big dynamic range. In this case, of course, I'm shooting up, so there's gonna be some sky, but these are pines, so you know we got a fair amount of tree cover. So, but when I do look at the back of the camera, I need to watch that histogram pretty closely. So I'm shooting about 1/15 f11. Trees are pretty dark. Gonna hope I can bring those up in Photoshop. And we're gonna take this image. I'll watch for blinkies. Not bad. Sure, interesting composition. So check focus. Aperture was f11 because I do have trees. Most of it's fairly far off, but just because of perspective, I think f11 is pretty safe. Zoom in a bit. Yeah, it's not bad. That's pretty good. Check that tree trunk. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Cool, I like that. Let me show you what I got, and then I think that's gonna wrap it up. Okay, one more quick composition. This is gonna be tricky because I've got this log right here in the foreground pretty close, but I like the trees in the back. Super low tripod here. Get my self timer on. Okay, so super low tripod. Got this moss covered log here. Trees in the background, nice low, a little bit of up. The depth of field on this is tricky because I've got log in the front, trees in the background. So I am up at f16 to start. Focus point is actually on the log, and we are gonna do a quick shot. Self timer. Cool, used the histogram to set the exposure, but we'll see how this turns out. I'm actually gonna crank this up to f22, several stops up, slow my shutter down, bring that histogram back over to the right. Okay, check the back of the camera for focus, zoom in, not too shabby. So I hope you enjoyed today's video about Aperture. I hope you learned a couple things. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more landscape photography content from me, including gear reviews, behind the scenes, and little tips and tricks like this, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything. And again, thank you for watching.